A rather disturbing survey came out just a few months ago, September 3rd through 5th. The results were published of this online caravan free speech survey that interviewed a cross-section of Americans as to their opinions on free speech and the First Amendment in general, and what those principles stand for, and if any changes ought to be made for the modern era. And the results, I think, to me, were fairly disturbing, coming from a certain perspective of valuing free speech. But let's look at what the survey talks about. And keep in mind, this survey is, no survey is perfect, and surveys can have methodological problems and errors and all sorts of things. So we want to take this with a big grain of salt. That being said, this survey can be instructive, and I feel that it is representative of a growing trend in America. But it is a survey of the gross number is 1,004 people. So I don't know what that exact number is to say it is representative of America, though they were careful to get people of different sexes appropriately, in the sense of having parity in terms of the appropriate amount of proportional to the United States, ages. They also looked at generations. As you can see here, you look on the screen, millennials, Gen Xers, baby boomers, which they categorized. And then they looked at race as well, region of the United States. So I think their methodology is fairly good. I wish they had included more people in the sample size, but that being what it is, let's look at this survey. The first question on this says, the First Amendment, which provides the right of Americans to have free speech, was enacted more than 200 years ago. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? The First Amendment goes too far in allowing hate speech in modern America and should be updated to reflect the cultural norms of today. Okay, so should the First Amendment be brought into modern times, as it were? Now, those who agreed, either by stating strongly agree or somewhat agree, the net of that was 51%. And that I think will be included in the title of this video, depending on what I name it. 51% of Americans on net agree with that statement, agree with the idea that the First Amendment needs to be updated to reflect cultural norms, that the freedom of speech should not be an absolute, that it should be scaled back in order to protect others from hate speech. And when I say hate speech, I'm not talking about just offensive language. I'm talking about legitimate speech that is hate, that falls short of inciting direct violence or enacts violent behavior or aggressive behavior or a credible threat. But the First Amendment does protect hate speech. And why that's the case is because if the First Amendment doesn't protect hate speech, it doesn't protect anything, because the whole point of the First Amendment was to allow speech of everybody on every topic. And the exceptions are not really exceptions of speech. They're exceptions of property rights or contract, or exceptions to violence or theft or fraud, not exceptions to speech itself, which you could talk about those. And so why the First Amendment protects even the most vile and even the most hateful speech, of course, falling short of violence itself or direct inciting violence or credible threat, is because if it does not, all speech becomes government speech. Those in power who would have to enforce these norms, which otherwise would have to be enforced through cultural or societal pressures of politeness or association or shame or whatever the case may be. Those who would have to enforce these norms would have to be the government. So if you do not have free speech, if you do not have all speech, if you start restricting some speech, you allow those in power to make the judgment, the value judgment of what speech is to be allowed, and whether or not human beings in power should exercise that power over fellow human beings is highly questionable. I think is inevitably going to lead to a tyranny. But most young people, actually lots of people, I'm not going to put this on younger people, because what does that even mean? What's young? But I've noticed a trend in terms of what tolerance is understood as, and I'm going to do another video on tolerance itself. But tolerance used to be understood as willingness to extend rights to one's political enemies, the rights which we expect for ourselves. So the statement as it used to go was, and does it still go? I do not respect what they're saying. I hate what they're saying. However, I will defend their right to say it freely, not with lack of any consequences whatsoever, but with lack of legal consequences and lack of violence. And it was disturbing to me. I've had a conversation where someone just said, well, I don't think the government should make a law restricting speech, but I think it should be free to beat them up, this whole punch a Nazi, or, go after these people that they've put themselves in this category by their speech, and therefore it's okay to do violence against them because they've aligned with by their speech with some sort of ideology. But I had to articulate that's exactly what the First Amendment is forbidding. It's preventing that, not just from the government, but from the mob of people willing to do violence against other people because their opinions are unpopular. So it is disturbing. 51% agree with this idea of this restriction of speech, even if it's hate speech, because what that means is their expectation of humans in power over other humans is greater than the value of allowing freedom for people they disagree with. And the problems for that are legion. But people want to scale back the First Amendment to restrict. And it's as if, here's what's concerning in addition to that, it's as if no one realized or thought about restricting free speech until today. It's just that in 2019, or the current year, we have these wisdomous cultural norms that were decided 15 minutes ago, and that we're the wisest generation of people on earth, most moral, most virtuous ever. And that everyone who came before us, we may simply dismiss as racist, sexists of the past, unenlightened, uninformed, savages, uneducated, not knowing the technology of today, not knowing the discoveries and advances of the modern time, and that therefore they can contribute nothing valuable, therefore we can simply dismiss them. Dismiss and dismantle all tradition without even questioning why it was there in the first place. There can be a healthy questioning of tradition, but this detachment and this dangerous dismissal of everything in the past, as if, do we really think that in 2019 we're the first ones to come up with the idea of restricting speech that we find to be objectionable. One of the values of coming to freedom of speech is they don't realize that freedom of speech has been a reality, and it's an imperfect one in an imperfect world, but that has been come to through experience over time and mistakes and errors and tyranny to get to this point of understanding the value of not restricting any freedom of speech, because it is a fundamental human right to think and express yourself, regardless of whether you're wrong, evil, and to limit the role of the state or the mob from interfering with that right. That this had never been thought of before. We're the only ones who could come up with the idea of restricting speech. It's just unbelievable that the willingness to detach from these things. And it's interesting what comes up in the survey of the things that I guess the respondents to the survey wish to detach from. They also say that this is another one that talks about the First Amendment goes too far in allowing hate speech in modern America and should be updated to reflect cultural norms of today. Or it's the same question, but continued. Oh, it says, do you think hate speech should be against the law? 48% said yes, and then 31% said no. 21% didn't know. Now, the 18 to 34 group, though, in this 50% said yes. Now, before we shake our heads at young people, and I'm in this group, the 18 to 34 currently, but the 35 to 44, 53% of them said no, said yes, hate speech should be against the law. We're talking now in the terms of hate speech laws, and I don't think there's always even a clear understanding of what a law even is anymore, because I've asked for years with several students, what should be consequences of nonviolent and non-legal ways of dealing with someone's speech? Meaning you don't harm them with physical violence or threat of violence, and you don't use the state to limit them. Well, what else are there? What are the range of consequences that may be between that? And they said, oh, well, giving them a ticket, maybe some jail time, something like that. They don't understand that a ticket and jail time involves statist violence to make those things happen, or community service. I mean, come on. So I'm extrapolating from a very limited experience of discussions with students, but I think there is something in that principle of not understanding what you mean when you say that there should be a law. You're saying that there should be statist violence to enforce this idea. Another question, do you think that hate speech should be against the law? Same question. Almost 50% said yes to that. Possible jail time, 54% of those who said yes, that there should be possible jail time for that. And then the other people who said yes, they were a little bit more lenient. They said nothing more than a ticket and a fine. And so they discussed further these ideas. They also talked about a further freedom of the First Amendment to punish the fake news and the freedom of the press. The government should be able to take action against newspapers, TV stations that publish content that is biased, inflammatory, or false. 57% agreed with this. And 58% were in the 35 to 44 group. They agreed with it. 63% in the 18 to 34. And there were categories of things that they thought should be punished. But the idea of alternative media should be knowing all the trash that's out there in alternative media, the emphasis of the importance of that should be more important than ever. Look at a place like China. Look at a place like the United States, with things being revealed from major news networks that were not reporting on major stories like the Epstein scandal, and telling us about their journalistic standards in doing so, and that they only admit to it when it comes out after the fact by these alternative sources. And so this is disturbing, but I think the message that needs to be understood from this is 51% of people feel this way. Perhaps it may not be, this may, again, is not a perfect survey, but 51% of the people feel this way, but that's why we have a First Amendment. We have a First Amendment so that no matter what the cultural feeling of the day may be, no matter what the pressures of an event or a tragedy or whatever those things may be, these things are laid down in the First Amendment, and I think still majorly built into the understanding of what it means to be an American. That being said, it's very fragile because it doesn't matter that it's written down. That helps. It doesn't mean it doesn't matter any way whatsoever. But I've argued for years that the true American Constitution is not just that it's written down in words and sentences, though that is important that we have a written Constitution as opposed to an unwritten Constitution like the British have, so that our government could be bound down by these. The importance of the Constitution, that our true Constitution is always unwritten, meaning it has to be in the cultural beliefs and principles of the people who have this moral fiber that believes in the values of the First Amendment. And again, just because of a majority of people feel a certain way, that's why you have the rights written down, so that the majority do not get to dictate at any time, through statist violence or otherwise, what the rights of others are or are not. And so this is the value of the First Amendment. It continues to allow this. However, there is a troubling cultural trend that is willing to sacrifice the hundreds of years of development to having a First Amendment in order to achieve other goals. For the right, it's usually security, but for the left, it's usually equality. And they're willing to sacrifice the rights and liberties of what they think is others. But really, they're sacrificing their own rights and liberties for these abstract, unattainable goals that can only be achieved through empowerment of the state, which is a danger to all of us. And so this is troubling. That being said, it is telling as well that that even though the U.S. prides itself on separation of church and state, being a secular state and all this stuff, that every religion, whether they call itself a religion or not, has its own blasphemy laws. There are things that people do not want you to blaspheme. On the left, it's political correctness. On the right, it's patriotic correctness. But there are these supposedly untouchable areas that are not allowed to be blasphemed, and which most people would be fine with using the force and violence of the state to enforce if you press them on it. And so that's why, imperfectly, you've got to have a First Amendment that allows it all. consequences being what they are, I think are minimized in that situation, as opposed to what you do when you start restricting true freedom of speech.